I am Michael. I am 33 years old. Exactly 6 months ago, a single, calculated insult at my family's Christmas dinner changed my life forever. While I was secretly pouring my blood, sweat, and savings into restoring a massive coastal estate, my own mother looked at me across a crowded table and mocked my entire existence. She raised her expensive crystal wine glass, pointed it toward my younger brother, and said, "Your brother just bought a beautiful house, a real home. When will you finally settle down and stop drifting?" My brother just sat there, swirling his bourbon, and smirked. He asked me, right in front of our entire extended family, when I was going to stop floating around and start building a real life. But there was one massive, undeniable thing they did not know. They did not know that I already owned a piece of premium real estate, completely free and clear, without a single cent owed to any bank. They did not know that while they were mocking my dirty boots and calloused hands, my brother was secretly drowning in a toxic swamp of high-interest debt and facing the total collapse of his fake, curated life. And today, the golden child is the one desperately begging for a financial bailout. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their perfect little illusion and took my dignity back, do me a favor. Hit that like button if you believe that justice is a dish best served absolutely freezing cold. And drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from today. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let us rewind to the exact moment the illusion shattered, right in the middle of my mother's perfectly staged dining room. To understand why my response that night hit the dining room table like a dropped grenade, you have to understand the specific role I was assigned in my family long before that Christmas. We were sitting around the massive, heavy mahogany table my parents bought when I was just a kid. The dining room was suffocatingly warm. The smell of roasted prime rib, expensive red wine, and burning pine filled the air. My mother had set the table with military precision. The silver was polished until it looked like a mirror. The heavy linen napkins were folded into perfect, rigid shapes. Everything in my mother's house was entirely curated for optics, and her children were no exception. We were not human beings to her. We were walking, talking status symbols that she could parade in front of her friends. Halfway through the dinner, she stood up. She tapped her silver spoon against her wine glass. The room immediately quieted down because my mother demanded an audience at all times. She looked at my younger brother, Vincent. Her gaze was so full of adoration that it almost looked manufactured, like something out of a bad television commercial. She talked endlessly about his recent promotion at his corporate job. She talked about his massive new salary. She went on and on about the new mortgage he just signed on a sprawling house in a gated community that had a brutally strict homeowners association. She used heavy, loaded words. Words like stability. Words like maturity. Words like success. She made sure everyone in the room, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, understood that Vincent had achieved the ultimate American dream. Then, right on cue, the pivot happened. My mother has always been an absolute master at using one son's milestone to publicly punish the other. It was her favorite game. She turned her sights on me. Her bright, beaming smile hardened just a fraction at the edges. She tilted her head, adopting that sickeningly sweet tone of fake maternal concern that is actually designed to draw blood. "Michael, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "I hope you were taking notes. Your brother just bought a beautiful house. A real house. I am just curious. When will you finally settle down? When will you find some stability?" Vincent leaned back in his heavy oak chair. He was wearing a dark, tailored cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my first work truck. He looked at me with that arrogant, satisfied smirk he had been practicing since we were teenagers. He dragged out his words, making sure his voice carried to the very end of the long table. "Yeah, Michael," Vincent said, chuckling softly. "When are you going to stop floating around from project to project? When are you going to start building a real life?" The entire table let out a soft, collective chuckle. It was that specific, cowardly kind of laugh people give when they think they are participating in a harmless inside family joke. My Aunt Sarah smiled behind her napkin. My father just stared down at his plate, completely avoiding my eyes. It was not a harmless joke. It was a calculated execution of my character, broadcasted live for everyone to see. For 10 long years, I had perfected the art of the awkward, defensive smile. I had spent a decade learning how to swallow my immense pride, stare at my food, and let them control the narrative of my life. I used to genuinely think that keeping the peace was worth the heavy price of my own dignity. I used to think that if I just worked hard enough, they would eventually see my worth. But sitting there that night, listening to the ice clinking in Vincent's glass and watching my mother's triumphant, glowing face, something inside my chest finally snapped. It was not a loud, violent, screaming kind of snap. It was a quiet, ice-cold realization that I was completely, utterly done. I reached out and set my heavy silver fork down on my porcelain plate. I did it very carefully. The sound was a sharp, distinct clink that cut through the low murmur of the room. It was loud enough to make my older sister, Megan, suddenly look up from her drink. I looked directly into Vincent's eyes, holding his gaze until his smirk faltered just a little bit. Then I shifted my eyes slowly to my mother. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of anger or hurt. I just gave them a calm, completely leveled smile. "I already did," I said. My voice was perfectly steady. "I already settled down. I just didn't invite anyone who constantly doubts me." The silence that immediately followed was absolute and suffocating. You could literally hear the crackle of the wood burning in the fireplace 2 rooms over. My mother blinked rapidly, her perfect, rigid posture faltering for a split second as her brain tried to process what I had just said. Vincent's smug little smirk froze entirely on his face, leaving him looking completely paralyzed by the sheer fact that the family punching bag had just hit back with a sledgehammer. But to truly understand the sheer, crushing weight of that sudden silence, and the glorious, undeniable destruction of their narrative that followed, we have to go back. We have to look closely at the invisible, suffocating cage they meticulously built around me for a decade, and the specific woman who happily handed them the lock and the key. In my mother's deeply flawed version of reality, a man's worth on this earth is entirely tied to a corporate job title, a predictable bi-weekly salary, a matching 401k, and the brand of car sitting in his driveway. Vincent understood this rigid system extremely early on. He played her game flawlessly. He went to the right, expensive business school. He wore the right, tailored suits. He aggressively climbed the corporate ladder, stepping on whoever he needed to step on along the way. He inherently knew exactly how to package his life into easily digestible, shiny sound bites that my mother could proudly brag about at her Sunday country club brunches. I was the exact opposite of everything she wanted. I absolutely hated the sterile, recycled air of corporate offices. I hated the endless, pointless meetings and the fake office politics. I found my true calling in thick wood dust, in the deep scent of aged cedar and raw pine, and in the intricate, historical architecture of forgotten homes. I became a master carpenter and a highly specialized historic restoration expert. While Vincent was sitting in climate-controlled conference rooms staring at meaningless spreadsheets, I was tearing down rotted load-bearing walls, breathing life back into estates that had been standing for over a century. I loved my work with a burning passion. It demanded absolute precision, immense physical endurance, and a deep, profound respect for history. I was not just building houses. I was preserving legacies. But my mother despised it. She hated anything she could not quickly summarize in one impressive, shallow sentence to her friends. When nosy relatives asked about me, she would dramatically sigh, lower her voice, and say I was doing some casual carpentry work. She made it sound like I was unemployed, doing odd jobs out of the back of a rusty, broken-down van just to pay for cheap beer. She completely, deliberately ignored the undeniable fact that I was managing incredibly complex restoration projects, dealing with highly demanding, wealthy clients, and slowly building a specialized business that people booked a year in advance. She framed my intense discipline and unconventional path as a tragic lack of ambition. And then came Julia. Julia and I dated for 3 intense years during my mid-20s. It was, without a doubt, the hardest, most grueling phase of my entire career. I was taking every single dollar I earned and putting it straight back into commercial-grade tools, liability insurance, and securing a decent workshop space. There were months when money was incredibly tight. I lived on cheap black coffee, instant noodles, and frozen meals so I could afford to buy the heavy-duty thickness planer and the specialized Japanese handsaws I desperately needed to take on bigger, more lucrative contracts. I explained my vision to Julia constantly. I told her this was a massive, long-term investment. I told her that building a legitimate business from the dirt up required brutal sacrifice now for absolute freedom later. At first, she claimed she supported me. She said she loved my passion. But as time went on, the harsh reality of an entrepreneur's life wore her down completely. She wanted the fancy, candlelit dinners on Friday nights. She wanted the predictable, all-inclusive vacations to Mexico. She looked directly at Vincent's flashy, debt-fueled life and constantly wondered out loud why I could not just give up and get a normal, safe job with benefits. The tension between us grew rapidly until it was a constant, suffocating, heavy presence in our tiny, cramped apartment. When the breakup finally happened, it was ugly, loud, and full of resentment. She packed her bags and told me I was choosing deadwood over a living relationship. It hurt, but the real, devastating betrayal came exactly a week later. I went to my parents' house for our usual Sunday dinner, genuinely hoping for just a little bit of quiet comfort or a distraction from the heartbreak. Instead, I walked straight into a calculated ambush. My mother was waiting for me in the kitchen. She did not ask how I was holding up. She did not offer a single shred of maternal sympathy or a warm cup of coffee. Instead, she crossed her arms tightly over her chest, leaned against the marble counter, and delivered the final, fatal blow to our relationship. She told me, with a strange glint of triumph in her eyes, that she had coffee with Julia the day before. She said Julia came to her in tears, complaining that she was completely exhausted from carrying my financial burdens. Julia had sat there and laid bare all my private, deepest vulnerabilities to the one person who would use them against me. She told my mother about my empty savings account during the winter slowdown, the lean months, the stress, the late nights poring over invoices. Julia handed my mother the exact, high-caliber ammunition she desperately needed to permanently label me a hopeless failure. My mother looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and utter disgust. She said it was absolutely no wonder Julia left me. She said a modern woman needs a man with a real salary, a college fund for future kids, and a solid career path, not a grown boy playing with power tools in a dusty garage. She told me it was time to finally give up this embarrassing hobby, swallow my ridiculous pride, and ask Vincent if his tech company was hiring entry-level sales reps. I stood there in the middle of her immaculate kitchen, feeling the ground completely drop out from under my heavy work boots. The woman I had deeply loved, the woman who knew how hard I was working for our future, had sold out my private struggles to the woman who loved to judge me more than anyone else on earth. It was a stunning, breathtaking betrayal. They had effectively teamed up behind my back to write my official family biography, and the permanent title of that book was Michael the Unstable Failure. From that horrible day forward, the narrative was completely set in stone. No matter what I achieved, no matter how many high-profile historic contracts I landed in the following years, it simply did not matter. In the established family mythology, I was forever the struggling, unreliable drifter who could not hold onto a woman or a dollar. I learned very quickly to stop sharing my victories. I learned the hard way that bringing my joy or my success to my family was exactly like handing fresh, wet paint to careless, destructive hands. They would only smear it and ruin it. So I went completely quiet. I built a massive wall around my life. I put my head down and I worked harder and smarter than anyone they knew. I started taking on massive restoration jobs for wealthy historical societies. I was quietly, methodically building real, tangible wealth, banking every single major check, living well below my means, and waiting for the right moment. The storm really began brewing a few years later, right around our annual family Thanksgiving dinner. Vincent had just landed a massive, highly publicized promotion. He was named the chief financial officer for a mid-sized, aggressively expanding tech firm. The ink was barely dry on his lucrative new corporate contract when he immediately went out and bought a sprawling, modern McMansion in a highly desirable, ridiculously expensive zip code. The house had absolutely zero character, zero history, and zero soul. It was just an aggressive, hollow display of newly acquired massive debt. But to my mother, it was the ultimate shining trophy. It was physical proof that she had raised a winner. That entire Thanksgiving dinner was completely dedicated to the absolute worship of Vincent's new real estate acquisition. He sat at the head of the table, passing around his brand new smartphone, forcing everyone to look at high-resolution photos of the vaulted ceilings, the pristine three-car garage, and the sterile, white marble kitchen island. He talked loudly about his incredibly low mortgage rate, the brutal property taxes, and the strict rules of his new homeowners association like he was giving a keynote speech on advanced financial literacy. My mother was completely in her element. She practically paraded him around the living room. She loudly declared to everyone within earshot that Vincent was finally setting the proper standard for this family. She talked endlessly about how his future children would have a massive inheritance, about how his promotion secured their legacy. And then, as she always predictably did, her eyes tracked across the crowded room and locked dead onto me. I was sitting quietly by the stone fireplace, nursing a cold beer, completely minding my own business and praying the night would end. She walked over, placing a condescending, heavy hand on my shoulder. She projected her voice so the nearby relatives could hear. She told me I should really swallow my pride, sit down with Vincent, and let him look over my messy finances. She said maybe, if I listened to him, he could help me figure out a clear path to real ownership, instead of just spending my life fixing up other people's broken, old things. The disrespect was so incredibly casual, so deeply ingrained in her DNA, that she did not even realize how utterly toxic and humiliating she sounded. Vincent chimed in from across the room, holding his glass of scotch. He offered, with a mocking smile, to introduce me to some entry-level guys at his firm. He said it was never too late to start a 401k and get a real paycheck. I felt a sudden, intense physical heat rising rapidly in my chest. I looked over at my father, who just stared intensely at his leather shoes, choosing his usual cowardice and a quiet life over defending his oldest son. I looked at my older sister Megan, who just rolled her eyes at the ceiling but said absolutely nothing to stop the barrage. I was entirely, profoundly alone in a room full of people who shared my last name. I left early that night. I did not make an excuse. I did not say goodbye. I just grabbed my heavy winter coat from the hall closet and walked out into the freezing, bitter November air. I got into my truck, turned the key, and drove. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white. My own mother, my own flesh and blood, using my life as a punchline to elevate my brother. I did not know exactly where I was going. I just drove north on the interstate, needing to put as much physical distance between myself and that deeply toxic environment as humanly possible. I ended up driving for hours, crossing the state border deep into Maine. The coastline up there was rugged, battered by the violent wind, and completely unforgiving. Felt exactly like my own state of mind. As the sun started to come up, I drove slowly through a small, forgotten coastal town. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a faded, handwritten, "For sale by owner," sign violently flapping in the wind. It was hammered into the frozen, dead grass in front of a massive, decaying property. I pulled the truck over and got out. It was a late 1800s coastal boarding house sitting proudly on 3 acres of prime, unobstructed oceanfront land. The massive roof was visibly sagging in the middle. The grand wraparound porch looked like a strong gust of winter wind would tear it completely off its foundation. The original white paint was peeling in long, sad, gray strips. Most normal people would have taken one look at it and seen a teardown, a financial black hole, a complete nightmare. But I am a master restoration expert. I did not see decay. I saw the incredible bones of the structure. I saw the incredibly thick, old-growth oak framing that had stubbornly survived 100 years of brutal saltwater storms. I saw a forgotten masterpiece just waiting for someone willing to bleed for it. I tracked down the owner that very afternoon at a local diner. It was an exhausted elderly man who could simply no longer manage the immense physical upkeep or the crushing property taxes. His children lived out of state and wanted absolutely nothing to do with the burden. They were actively discussing selling it to a commercial developer who would bulldoze the century of history and put up cheap, soulless summer condos. I walked through the freezing house with him. My heavy boots crunched loudly on broken window glass and dead, dry leaves that had blown straight through the shattered window panes in the parlor. We stood in the grand foyer, and I asked him for his absolute bottom-line price. He looked at me, sighed, and named a number. It was a number that was shockingly low for 3 acres of coastal land value, but absolutely astronomical for a house in that terrifying state of disrepair. I did not flinch. I did not blink. Over the past 5 long, lonely years, my quiet, grueling work had paid off immensely. I had aggressively hoarded cash. I lived far, far below my means. I had enough liquid capital sitting in my accounts to buy the entire property outright, in cold hard cash, without asking a bank for a single dime. No mortgage, no leverage, no crushing monthly interest payments. Just pure, unadulterated ownership. I signed the preliminary papers exactly a week later. I hired a ruthless local real estate lawyer to meticulously ensure the title was completely clean and the deed was locked down tight in a private, anonymous trust. I initiated the wire transfer, moving my entire life savings across the country. It was absolutely terrifying and deeply exhilarating at the exact same time. I owned a massive piece of the earth. But the most important, defining decision I made that cold afternoon was the strict vow of silence. I decided right then and there, standing on my own broken porch looking at the freezing ocean, that I would not tell my family a single word. I would not give my mother the chance to dismiss my massive estate as a quirky little project. I would not give Vincent the chance to endlessly compare it to his sterile, highly mortgaged box in the suburbs. This was mine. Completely, entirely mine. The next 6 months of my life were the most brutal, grueling, physically devastating, and profoundly satisfying days I have ever experienced. I packed up my truck, left my old rented workshop behind, and moved directly into the one small room on the ground floor of the main estate that did not have a massive leak in the ceiling. I woke up at exactly 4 o'clock in the morning every single day. The Maine coastal winters are entirely relentless. The freezing damp cold seeps deep into your joints, into your very bones, and stays there permanently until late May. I started immediately with the absolute most critical part, the structural integrity of the house. I spent 3 solid weeks in the dark, damp, freezing basement, manually reinforcing the ancient stone foundation and replacing massive, rotted wooden joists. Because of the sheer scale of the estate, I had to hire a local crew for the heavy lifting. The foreman I hired was a guy named Tom. Tom was a deeply hardened, cynical New England contractor who initially looked at me like I was just another wealthy, delusional city kid playing with a hammer on a doomed project. We violently clashed on day 1. He wanted to immediately rip out the original, sweeping grand staircase in the foyer and replace it with cheap, prefab commercial lumber to save time and money. I flatly refused. I looked him dead in the eye and told him we were restoring the original wood, piece by painstaking piece. Tom laughed right in my face. He told me it was structurally impossible without severely compromising the load limit, and that I was going to get someone killed. I did not argue with him. I simply put on my heavy leather tool belt, brought out my specialized, expensive clamping rigs, and spent 14 straight, agonizing hours reconstructing the massive main stringer using traditional, centuries-old joinery methods. My hands were bleeding, my back was screaming, but I did not stop. When Tom came back the next morning with his coffee, he walked into the foyer, stood at the bottom of the stairs and stared. He kicked the bottom step with his heavy steel-toed boot as hard as he could. It did not budge a millimeter. He looked at me, slowly nodded his head, and walked away. He never questioned my expertise again. In fact, over the next few months, Tom became my absolute right-hand man and fiercely loyal ally. Word travels incredibly fast in small, tight-knit coastal towns. A highly influential, wealthy local investor named Elias caught wind of the idiot from out of town, who was stubbornly restoring the old, doomed boarding house. Elias owned several massive historic commercial properties up and down the eastern seaboard. He stopped by my property unannounced one freezing Tuesday afternoon. He stood quietly in the corner of my newly built barn workshop, watched me work a piece of raw mahogany for 20 minutes without saying a single word, and then approached me. He offered me the most lucrative commercial contract of my entire career right there on the spot. He was currently dealing with a massive, multimillion-dollar lawsuit against a previous, fraudulent contractor who had completely botched the highly sensitive restoration of the town's historic library. Elias desperately needed someone to fix the unmitigated disaster before the city council stepped in, and he wanted me. That one contract alone guaranteed my cash flow and salary for the next 2 solid years. It was the ultimate vindication of my skills. By late summer, the boarding house had completely transformed. The sagging roof was now solid, heavy slate, and perfectly secure. The rotting exterior was completely repaired and painted a deep, commanding, striking navy blue. The massive workshop I built from scratch in the detached barn was state-of-the-art, filled with the best equipment money could buy. I had a fully renovated, beautiful, light-filled apartment upstairs for myself, and I was actively preparing to open the remaining 10 rooms as a high-end, exclusive retreat for artists and writers. I had built an absolute empire in total, deafening silence. The only person in my entire family who knew the absolute truth was my grandmother. I trusted her implicitly. She had always quietly seen through my mother's toxic obsession with superficial status. I invited her up to Maine in early October. When her taxi pulled into the long, freshly laid gravel driveway, she did not look at the massive house with greedy dollar signs in her eyes. She looked directly at the intricate craftsmanship. She slowly walked through the heavy, restored oak front doors, ran her frail hand along the wainscoting I had painstakingly sanded and stained, and she smiled a genuine, warm smile. Later that afternoon, she sat on the wide front porch with me, drinking hot tea, looking out at the endless, crashing gray waves of the Atlantic Ocean. She turned to me and told me she was incredibly proud of me. Not because of what the massive house cost, not because of its real estate value, but because of the sheer resilience and character it represented. Before she left to go back to the city, she reached into her bag and handed me a heavy, worn wooden box. Inside was my late grandfather's vintage block plane, a tool he had used to build his own very first house decades ago. She looked me in the eye and told me I had finally earned the right to hold it. That quiet, profound validation meant more to me than 1,000 empty, screaming compliments from my mother ever could. As December finally rolled around, the annual, suffocating dread of the mandatory family Christmas dinner began to surface in the back of my mind. But this time, the feeling in my gut was completely different. I was not the exact same broken man who had walked out of Thanksgiving a year ago. I was not a struggling, defensive carpenter desperately trying to justify his mere existence to people who did not care. I was a landowner. I was a highly successful business owner holding premium, mortgage-free real estate and a massive backlog of high-paying commercial contracts. I packed my overnight bag, locked the heavy, secure front door of my sprawling estate, and got into my truck. The long drive down the cold coast to Connecticut was incredibly quiet and peaceful. I watched the thick snow falling silently on the dark highway, feeling a strange, deep, unshakable sense of calm settling into my bones. I knew exactly what was waiting for me at my parents' house. I knew the exact, condescending script my mother had prepared. I knew the arrogant, pathetic performance Vincent was going to put on for the relatives. But as I pulled my truck into their driveway and looked at the perfectly arranged, completely fake Christmas lights glowing brightly in the dark, a slow, cold smile spread across my face. They thought they were holding all the winning cards. They had absolutely no idea I was about to walk in there and flip the entire table. The drive from the rugged, freezing coast of Maine down to the perfectly manicured suburbs of Connecticut gave me a lot of time to think. For the first time in my entire adult life, I was not gripping the steering wheel in a state of high anxiety. I did not have a knot of dread sitting heavy in my stomach. When you build a life that you are genuinely proud of, a life rooted in hard work and absolute undeniable truth, the opinions of people who only value the superficial suddenly lose all their terrifying power. I pulled my heavy work truck into my parents' wide asphalt driveway. The house looked exactly the same as it always did. The Christmas lights were perfectly symmetrical, draped over the expensive landscaping with absolute precision. It was the kind of house that was designed specifically to impress the neighbors rather than provide comfort to the people actually living inside it. I turned off the engine, grabbed my duffel bag, and walked up to the heavy mahogany front door. Before I even had the chance to ring the bell, my mother swung the door open. She was wearing a pristine, cream-colored cashmere sweater and a string of pearls. Her smile was incredibly bright, but it did not reach her eyes. It never did when she looked at me. The very first thing she did was look down at my heavy leather boots, her nose wrinkling just a fraction of an inch, as if I had just tracked mud into a museum. She told me to leave my boots on the porch because she had just had the hardwood floors professionally buffed and polished. She did not ask about my drive. She did not ask how I was feeling. She immediately launched into a frantic, hushed set of instructions about how I needed to behave tonight. She told me Aunt Sarah and Uncle David were already in the living room, and she explicitly warned me not to bring up anything depressing about the construction industry. She wanted the evening to be light, elegant, and focused entirely on positive milestones. I simply nodded, took off my boots, and stepped into the suffocating warmth of the house. The smell of roasting prime rib, cinnamon, and expensive pine candles hit me like a physical wall. I walked into the living room, and the scene was set exactly as I had predicted. Vincent was standing directly in front of the massive stone fireplace, completely holding court. He was holding a heavy crystal glass of an incredibly expensive single malt scotch. He was wearing a tailored suit jacket over a crisp white shirt, looking every inch the highly paid corporate executive. Aunt Sarah and Uncle David were sitting on the leather sofa, leaning forward, completely captivated by whatever corporate buzzwords he was throwing around. When Vincent saw me walk into the room, he paused his grand monologue. He gave me a slow, condescending up and down look. He loudly welcomed me, asking if my truck had managed to survive the highway without breaking down. Aunt Sarah chuckled softly. It was the classic Vincent opening move. Establish the hierarchy within the first 10 seconds of interaction. He was the successful, wealthy executive, and I was the blue-collar older brother who was barely scraping by. I did not take the bait. I just smiled, walked over to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. I watched them perform. It was truly a masterful theater production. My mother floated around the room, constantly touching Vincent's shoulder, making sure everyone's glass was full, and steering every single conversation directly back to Vincent's recent achievements. She was laying the groundwork for the trap she was going to spring at the dinner table. She needed the entire audience completely primed. She needed everyone fully aware of Vincent's massive salary, his big promotion, and most importantly, his brand new real estate acquisition. When my mother finally announced that dinner was served, the choreography of the seating arrangement was incredibly telling. Vincent was seated at the immediate right hand of my father, the place of absolute honor. My mother sat at the opposite end of the long table, the ultimate director of the evening. I was placed near the far corner, wedged between a quiet cousin and a towering floral centerpiece that almost completely blocked my view of the room. It was the physical manifestation of my place in this family. Out of sight, out of mind, and only acknowledged when it served a specific purpose. The first half of the dinner was a relentless, exhausting barrage of self-congratulation. My mother stood up to deliver her annual Christmas toast. Then, exactly as I knew she would, she slowly turned her head and locked her eyes directly on me. The warmth in her face instantly vanished, replaced by that sickening, artificial concern. The entire table suddenly went dead silent. Everyone knew exactly what was happening. This was the main event. This was the moment my mother used the golden child's blinding success to illuminate the scapegoat's massive failures. She asked me in front of 12 people when I was going to finally settle down. She asked when I was going to stop drifting from one dusty project to another and find some actual stability. Vincent leaned back in his heavy oak chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He looked directly at me. His face stretched into a cruel, deeply satisfied smirk. He doubled down on my mother's insult. He asked me when I was going to stop floating around and start building a real life. He offered to introduce me to some low-level hiring managers at his firm, saying they might have a spot in the mailroom or basic maintenance. The table let out that terrible, cowardly, collective chuckle. It was the exact sound of a dozen people actively choosing to align themselves with the bully to avoid becoming the target. For 10 years, that exact sound had been my absolute breaking point. It was the sound that usually made me lower my eyes, stare at my plate, and mentally check out of the room. But not tonight. Tonight, I was not standing on their shaky, superficial ground. I was standing on 3 acres of prime, oceanfront bedrock. I felt my heart beating a slow, steady, powerful rhythm in my chest. I set my heavy silver fork down on my porcelain plate. The sharp clink of the metal cut through the remaining laughter like a knife. I looked at Vincent. I looked at his expensive watch, his tailored suit, and the immense arrogance radiating from his face. Then I looked at my mother. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the blazing anger that used to consume me. I simply offered them a calm, leveled, completely unbothered smile. I told them I already did. I told them I just didn't invite anyone who constantly doubts me. The immediate reaction was incredibly beautiful to witness. The smug, superior smirk on Vincent's face did not just fade. It violently shattered. His jaw literally slackened. My mother's eyes widened in absolute shock. The silence that fell over the dining room was so heavy, so completely suffocating, that you could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. I had completely broken the script. The family punching bag was not supposed to hit back. The scapegoat was not supposed to have a secret weapon. I sat there, perfectly still, letting the absolute weight of my words press down on the entire room, watching the panic slowly begin to dawn in my mother's eyes as she realized she had completely lost control of the narrative. The suffocating silence stretched on for what felt like an absolute eternity. Vincent was the first one to finally find his voice, though it completely lacked the deep, booming confidence he had been projecting all evening. He let out a short, nervous, highly defensive laugh. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of the mahogany table. "What is that supposed to mean?" Vincent asked, his voice cracking just a fraction. "What do you mean you already did? Did you rent a nicer apartment or something?" I slowly picked up my water glass, took a deliberate sip, and set it back down. I made sure every single eye at that table was locked entirely on me. "No, Vincent," I said calmly. "It means that exactly 6 months ago, I bought a massive late 19th century coastal boarding house sitting on 3 acres of prime oceanfront real estate in Maine. It means I spent the last half year entirely rebuilding the structural foundation, restoring the historic architecture, and constructing a state-of-the-art, commercial-grade workshop on the property. It is my permanent home. It is my business headquarters. And it is completely 100% mine." My mother actually gasped. She clutched her expensive pearl necklace, staring at me as if I had just spoken a completely alien language. Her mind was frantically spinning, trying desperately to find a way to minimize what I had just revealed, trying to shove me back into the tiny, pathetic box she had built for me. "Well, Michael," she stammered, forcing a brittle, incredibly fake smile onto her face. "That sounds like a very quirky little project. Buying an old, broken-down shack in the middle of nowhere. But Vincent bought a real, modern family home in a prestigious community. There is a very big difference between a hobby project and actual adult stability." I felt a cold, sharp focus wash completely over me. I was not going to let her spin this. I was going to systematically dismantle her entire argument with cold, hard, undeniable facts. "You are absolutely right, Mom," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "There is a massive difference. Vincent bought a sterile, mass-produced box built with cheap materials, and he financed it with a massive 30-year adjustable-rate mortgage. He does not actually own that house. The bank owns that house. He is just renting it from them with massive interest payments. If he misses 2 paychecks, the bank will take his stability right out from under him. Vincent's face turned absolutely crimson. He opened his mouth to shout, but I cut him off instantly, my voice ringing out clear and authoritative across the dining room. I bought my 3-acre coastal estate in pure cash, I stated, watching the blood completely drain from my mother's face. I do not have a mortgage. I do not owe a single dime to any bank, any lender, or any person sitting at this table. I hold the absolute clear deed in a private trust. Furthermore, the quirky little project you just tried to mock is currently facilitating a massive, multi-million-dollar commercial restoration lawsuit contract that I secured with one of the wealthiest private investors on the eastern seaboard. My business is fully booked for the next 2 solid years. I have built a fortress, Mom. I am entirely, completely untouchable. Vincent was literally shaking with rage and humiliation. He threw his linen napkin onto his plate. He tried to muster a comeback, but he had absolutely nothing. He was a man drowning in corporate debt, sitting across from a man who had built total financial freedom with his bare hands. The silence that followed my financial declaration was absolutely deafening. Aunt Sarah looked down at her lap, completely mortified. My father stared at his wine glass, completely paralyzed by his usual cowardice. My mother looked like she had just been physically struck. Her entire worldview, her carefully constructed hierarchy of who held value and who did not, had just been completely incinerated right in front of her. Then, from the middle of the table, my older sister Megan finally spoke. Megan had spent her entire adult life choosing silence to keep the peace, but tonight, the dam finally broke. "Are you going to congratulate him, Mom?" Megan asked. Her voice was quiet, but it carried an edge of absolute steel. My mother snapped her head toward Megan, her eyes flashing with defensive anger. "Excuse me? You heard me?" Megan said, sitting up incredibly straight, refusing to back down. "You just spent 20 minutes giving a massive, glowing speech about Vincent signing a piece of paper that puts him millions of dollars in debt to a bank. Michael just told you he bought an oceanfront estate in cash and secured a massive commercial contract. Why aren't you raising your glass to him? Why aren't you asking everyone to applaud his stability?" My mother's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. I am happy for him, of course. I just think keeping secrets from your own family is incredibly deceitful. He kept it a secret because he knew exactly what you would do. Megan fired back, her voice rising in the quiet room. Every single time Michael achieves something incredible, you translate it into something vague and pathetic. Every time Vincent does something completely average, you treat it like he just cured a disease. You don't hear yourself, Mom, but the rest of us do. The rest of us have been listening to you use Michael as a stepping stone for Vincent's ego for a decade. It is toxic, it is cruel, and it is finally over. Before my mother could even launch her screaming counterattack, the absolute ultimate authority in the family spoke up. My grandmother, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table sipping her water, set her glass down. She is an incredibly sharp, no-nonsense woman who sees through absolutely everything. "Megan is entirely correct," my grandmother said. Her voice was not loud, but it commanded absolute, unquestionable respect. "Eleanor, you have spent years speaking about Michael as if his life is some sort of tragic failure because his path does not flatter your incredibly shallow imagination. And now you are visibly upset because he built an absolute empire without submitting it for your toxic inspection and approval. You should be deeply ashamed of your behavior tonight." The look of absolute, naked panic on my mother's face was something I will never, ever forget. She had been publicly called out, completely dismantled, and stripped of her narrative power by her own daughter and her own mother. The dinner completely unraveled after that. People quietly pushed their plates away. The incredibly expensive prime rib sat entirely untouched. The illusion of the perfect, happy, successful family was completely dead on the table. I stood up, calmly picked up my empty plate and walked it into the kitchen. I was putting my heavy coat on in the hallway when my mother frantically marched out of the dining room. She always, without fail, preferred private, emotional manipulation after a massive public failure. She cornered me by the front door, her voice dropping into a harsh, trembling whisper. "You completely embarrassed your brother in there," she hissed, her eyes shining with angry, manipulative tears. "Family does not do this to each other, Michael. We do not try to ruin each other's special moments." I finished buttoning my heavy winter coat, looking down at her with absolutely zero sympathy. "No, Mom," I said, my voice incredibly calm. "I did not embarrass Vincent. I simply embarrassed the completely fictional story you have been telling about me for 10 years. You were standing way too close to it, and you got hit by the shrapnel when I blew it up. You are twisting this," she pleaded, desperately trying to play the ultimate victim. "I am just a mother who is proud of her son." "You are a mother who needs a hierarchy," I corrected her, staring directly into her soul. "You need one child to shine so you can take the credit, and you need another child to fail so you have someone to look down on. Family doesn't use one sibling's milestone to publicly shame another. You don't get to call this a loving family when the absolute price of admission is my permanent silence and humiliation." I opened the heavy mahogany front door. The freezing winter wind rushed into the suffocatingly warm house. I stepped out onto the porch, leaving her completely speechless in the doorway. I walked to my truck, got in, and drove away into the snowy night. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I felt entirely, perfectly clean. I had finally burned down the fake cage they built for me, and I was entirely free. 6 months later, the brutal, freezing Maine winter finally broke, giving way to a brilliantly bright, crisp coastal spring. The heavy snow melted, revealing the massive, sweeping green lawns of my estate leading straight down to the rocky Atlantic cliffs. The transformation of the property was entirely complete, and the reality of my new life far exceeded even my most ambitious dreams. I officially opened the renovated wings of the historic boarding house as an exclusive, high-end creative retreat. Within the first 2 weeks, we were completely booked solid for the next year and a half. Writers, architects, and artists were paying premium rates for the absolute silence, the heavy antique architecture, and the crashing sound of the ocean. My commercial restoration business was booming. Elias, the wealthy private investor who had given me my massive break, was so deeply impressed by my meticulous work on the town's historic library that he personally contacted the editors of a highly prestigious national architectural magazine. They sent a full photography crew to my estate in May. They shot the massive, sweeping oak staircase I had rebuilt by hand. They photographed my state-of-the-art barn workshop. When the massive feature article finally dropped, it spanned 8 pages. It detailed my absolute dedication to preserving historic structural integrity and highlighted the massive commercial success of my independent business model. The magazine was distributed nationally. I knew, with absolute certainty, that a copy of it would inevitably find its way onto the glass coffee tables of my mother's precious country club friends. I was standing in my workshop on a Tuesday afternoon, running a beautiful piece of reclaimed mahogany through the heavy thickness planer, when my cell phone vibrated on the workbench. It was my sister, Megan. We had spoken frequently since that explosive Christmas dinner. She had finally started setting her own firm boundaries with our mother, and our relationship had grown incredibly strong. I turned off the loud machinery, wiped the thick sawdust from my hands, and answered the call. Megan did not bother with small talk. Her voice was heavy, carrying a mixture of exhaustion and profound, dark irony. "Have you heard about Vincent?" she asked immediately. I leaned back against my heavy oak workbench. "I haven't spoken to him or Mom since I walked out the door on Christmas." "What happened?" Megan let out a long, heavy sigh. "The entire house of cards just violently collapsed, Michael. It is an absolute, unmitigated disaster." She proceeded to tell me the absolute truth behind the shiny, heavily curated facade Vincent had been aggressively parading around for years. His massive corporate salary, the one my mother worshipped like a religion, was absolutely nowhere near enough to sustain the completely delusional lifestyle he was actively trying to project. He had financed that massive, sterile McMansion using a highly toxic, adjustable-rate mortgage that he barely qualified for. He had leased the incredibly expensive luxury cars. He was drowning in massive, high-interest credit card debt just to buy the tailored suits and the expensive watches to impress people who did not actually care about him. When the tech sector experienced a sudden, brutal market correction in early spring, Vincent's company underwent massive restructuring. His executive stock options became completely worthless overnight, and his heavily inflated salary was severely slashed. Without those massive quarterly bonuses, he completely defaulted on the massive mortgage. The bank officially initiated foreclosure proceedings last week, Megan told me, her voice incredibly grim. But that isn't even the worst part. His wife found out about the massive mountain of hidden debt. She found out there is absolutely zero money in the college fund for the kids. The accounts are completely drained. She officially filed for divorce on Monday morning. Her lawyer is going straight for full custody, arguing that Vincent's massive financial negligence makes him an unfit provider. I stood there in the quiet of my massive, fully owned workshop, listening to the crashing sound of the ocean through the open barn doors. I did not feel the sudden, massive rush of vindictive joy or triumphant gloating that you might expect in a movie. I just felt a deep, profound wave of sadness for the massive, destructive lie my family had worshipped. Vincent had built his entire identity on a foundation of quicksand, heavily encouraged by a mother who only valued the shiny, superficial surface. They had constantly mocked me for working with my hands, for taking the slow, difficult path of building real equity and actual tangible value. They had laughed at my dirty boots and my calloused hands, completely blind to the fact that I was pouring a solid concrete foundation while they were aggressively building a massive castle in the sky out of toxic debt and sheer arrogance. Mom is having an absolute, complete psychological meltdown, Megan continued, her voice tight. She is desperately calling every single lawyer she knows, trying to figure out a way to stop the bank from taking the house. She is terrified of the massive public humiliation. She knows her friends at the club are going to see the foreclosure notice. The entire fake reality she built is completely dead. I took a deep breath of the sharp, salty Maine air. What did she say about the magazine article? I asked quietly. Megan actually let out a short, dry laugh. She saw it. Aunt Sarah brought a copy directly to her house. Mom locked herself in her bedroom for 2 solid days. She literally cannot process the undeniable fact that the son she ruthlessly threw away is on the cover of a National Architectural Digest, while her golden boy is sitting in a lawyer's office trying to figure out how to pay for a divorce on credit. I told Megan I loved her, told her she had an open invitation to come up to the estate whenever she needed peace, and hung up the phone. I looked around my massive, solid, fully funded empire. The absolute downfall of the villain is never quite as loud as their arrogant rise. It is usually just a quiet, incredibly pathetic collapse under the massive weight of their own lies. Later that evening, I walked out onto the massive, sweeping wraparound porch of my estate. The sun was slowly setting over the deep, dark Atlantic Ocean, painting the sky in incredible vivid streaks of bruised purple and burning orange. I sat down in one of the heavy, solid oak rocking chairs I had built by hand, holding a hot cup of black coffee. The only sound for miles was the rhythmic, incredibly soothing crash of the heavy waves violently hitting the ancient coastal rocks below my property line. I thought about Vincent, sitting in a sterile lawyer's office, aggressively fighting over the absolute ruins of his fake, heavily financed life. I thought about my mother, desperately hiding behind her drawn curtains, mourning the absolute funeral of her ridiculous, superficial expectations. For my entire life, I had allowed her deeply toxic metrics of success to actively poison my own mind. I had spent so many sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, genuinely wondering if I was doing everything completely wrong because my life did not look like a shiny corporate brochure. But sitting on my own porch, looking out at the massive estate I owned free and clear, I finally understood the profound, ultimate truth. Real, actual wealth is not the expensive car you lease to impress strangers at a stoplight. It is not the massive, heavily mortgaged house that keeps you awake in a cold sweat at 3 in the morning. Real, tangible wealth is absolute peace. It is the profound, quiet safety of knowing that nobody on earth can pull the rug out from under you. It is the incredible dignity of looking in the mirror and knowing that every single thing you have, you built with your own blood, sweat, and unyielding integrity. My phone buzzed in my heavy canvas jacket pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text message from my grandmother. She was not a woman who wasted words on digital communication very often. The message was incredibly short and exactly to the point. "I saw the magazine," she wrote. "Your grandfather would be incredibly proud of those joints. I am taking the train up next Thursday. Have the tea ready." I smiled, a real, deep, genuine smile that reached all the way to my eyes, and typed back a quick confirmation. She was the only person from my past who had earned the absolute right to sit on this porch and share this incredible piece with me. She was the only one who had respected the heavy timber of my character long before it was beautifully polished and published in a glossy national magazine. As for my mother and Vincent, I have permanently established a boundary made of absolute solid steel. I do not answer their frantic, desperate calls. I do not reply to the manipulative, guilt-tripping emails demanding financial help for Vincent's massive legal fees. When you finally recognize that certain people only see you as a convenient resource or a stepping stone for their own ego, cutting them out completely is not an act of cruelty. It is an absolute, non-negotiable act of basic self-preservation. I am no longer the family punching bag. I am not the convenient scapegoat. I am the architect of my own incredibly solid reality, and the heavy doors to this estate remain permanently locked to anyone who ever demanded that I shrink myself to make them feel comfortable. I built this life plank by heavy plank. I endured the blistering cold, the aching muscles, the empty bank accounts, and the brutal, cutting insults. I survived the absolute worst of their psychological warfare, and I came out the other side holding the permanent deed to my own unshakable freedom. Thank you so incredibly much for taking this long, intense journey with me today. It takes a massive amount of courage to stand up to the people who share your blood, and I know exactly how terrifying it can be to finally speak the absolute truth in a room full of committed liars. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to permanently burn down a toxic relationship to save your own life? Please, share your incredible story in the comments below. Your voice absolutely matters, and you never know who desperately needs to hear it today. And please, do not forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next journey. Until next time, keep building your own foundation, and never, ever let anyone tell you what your life is worth.